In a world where the lines between personal history and professional duty blur, one life-changing event puts Dr. Maya Thompson, a brilliant and resilient surgeon, face to face with a man who once shaped her past in the most painful way. Senator Charles Whitmore, a powerful politician notorious for his divisive, racially charged rhetoric, arrives at St. Augustine Medical Center in critical condition. With his life hanging by a thread, the only surgeon capable of saving him is Maya, the very woman whose dreams he tried to destroy years ago. The operating room becomes a battlefield, not of scalpels and sutures, but of integrity, restraint, and unspoken wounds. As Maya grapples with the weight of the moment, she's forced to confront old scars and the question of whether some people even deserve grace. But the real conflict begins after Whitmore's recovery. His words, dismissive, cruel, and unchanged, ignite a storm within Maya, one that threatens to undo everything she has fought for. Yet amid the anger and doubt, small moments of unexpected kindness remind Maya of her true strength and the power of perseverance. Dr. Maya Thompson had long stopped believing in fair fights. Life never promised justice. It didn't matter how smart you were or how hard you worked, life could still bury you under its weight. Tonight, as she drove to St. Augustine Medical Center, the glow of her headlights pierced through the drizzling rain. The hospital loomed ahead, its sterile white lights spilling across empty parking lots and wet pavement. She was on the night shift again, covering for another doctor, but work had always been her sanctuary. In the cold, unfeeling walls of surgery, nothing mattered but skill and focus. She parked her aging blue sedan in the farthest corner of the lot, where the streetlights barely reached. Maya wasn't a flashy person. Her car, though reliable, carried scratches along its side, remnants of a past fender bender she never bothered to fix. Her apartment was similar, functional, modest, and tucked away in a quieter part of the city. It had mismatched furniture, the kind you find at second-hand stores, and one framed photo on the kitchen counter. Her mother, graying but smiling proudly, arm in arm with a younger Maya on the day she got into medical school. Walking briskly through the rain, her scrub pants damp from the knees down, Maya entered the hospital. The air inside was cool, almost sterile, and filled with the faint smell of disinfectant. Her pager buzzed against her hip, a familiar hum that broke her from her thoughts. She didn't even need to check it. "Nurse Reyes," she called, her voice calm but firm as she approached the reception desk. "What do we have?" The nurse, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, softened only by her kind demeanor, looked up with a grim expression. "It's Senator Whitmore, cardiac arrest. He was stabilized briefly on arrival, but it's bad. You're the only attending surgeon available for an emergency procedure." For the first time in years, Maya froze. Her fingers gripped the edge of the desk. "Whitmore," she echoed faintly. Reyes nodded. "Yeah, the senator. Charles Whitmore." The name alone pulled Maya backward into a memory she thought she had buried. It had been 12 years ago, but she could still hear his voice in the back of her mind, sharp, dismissive, and soaked in unspoken prejudice. Maya had been 20 years old then, wide-eyed and full of hope. She sat at a scholarship panel interview, her palms clammy, but her heart bursting with ambition. She had worked harder than anyone she knew. Her grades were flawless, her recommendations glowing, and she dreamed of studying abroad to kickstart her medical career. Whitmore had been on the panel that day, a local congressman, a figure people respected without question. He was seated at the center of a long table, his sharp suit making him look untouchable. Maya remembered how his cold, pale eyes swept over her, his smile thin and insincere. "I just wonder," he had said, interrupting Maya mid-sentence, "if someone like you truly fits the mold. There are candidates who better represent the values of this program." His words weren't loud or explicit. They didn't have to be. The room had fallen silent, and Maya had looked down at her folded hands, feeling a quiet shame she couldn't explain. She knew exactly what he meant. Someone like her. A month later, she received the rejection letter. She cried for days but never told anyone why. Instead, she picked herself up, taking out loans and working night shifts as a waitress to fund her way through school. Now, standing in the bright hospital lobby, Maya blinked away the memory and straightened her shoulders. "Prep the OR," she said sharply, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Get me his vitals, the full report, and call Dr. Lawson for anesthesiology." Reyes nodded, bustling away to relay the orders. Maya turned on her heel, heading for the locker room to grab her surgical cap and gown. The echoes of her footsteps felt loud against the polished floor. Her chest tightened with every step. Charles Whitmore, she thought bitterly. He was still the same. His political career had been riddled with controversies, insensitive remarks, coded language that pitted people against each other, and a refusal to acknowledge systemic inequalities. She had learned long ago not to give his words power over her, but now fate had placed his life in her hands. The irony stung. Once inside the locker room, Maya paused in front of the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her stoic, composed, and confident in her dark blue scrubs, but her eyes betrayed her. Beneath her calm exterior, resentment boiled to the surface, and her pulse quickened. "No one else can do this," she murmured to herself, pressing her palms against the cold metal of the sink. "He is just another patient, that's all." But was that true? Could she really pretend his life meant no more than the others she had saved? The same man who once believed she didn't belong? Could she erase the years of struggle caused by his words? A sudden knock on the door startled her. "Dr. Thompson?" It was Dr. Emily Lawson, her colleague and closest friend at St. Augustine's. Emily pushed the door open, her soft face lined with concern. "They're wheeling him into OR3. Are you okay?" Maya hesitated before answering. "I'm fine." Emily frowned, stepping closer. "Maya, it's okay to feel conflicted. You don't have to pretend, but you also don't have to carry the weight of who he is. You're a surgeon. It's what you do best." Maya met Emily's gaze, appreciating her friend's gentle honesty. Emily always seemed to know when something troubled her, even when Maya said nothing. "Thanks, Em," Maya replied quietly, her voice softening. "I needed that." Emily smiled faintly and gave Maya's shoulder a supportive squeeze. "Let's save him." In the operating room, the air was cool and heavy with anticipation. The rhythmic beep of monitors filled the silence, punctuated by the rustle of surgical instruments being prepared. Maya stood at the head of the table, staring down at Charles Whitmore. Without the cameras and microphones, he was just a man vulnerable, unconscious, and reliant on the hands he would never have trusted if given the choice. "Scalpel," Maya ordered, her voice steady. The nurse placed the instrument in her gloved hand, and the procedure began. Every incision, every stitch, demanded precision. Maya fell into the rhythm of the surgery, her training taking over. Her hands moved with purpose, steady, practiced, and calm. The resentment she felt toward Whitmore became a distant hum, drowned out by her singular focus. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Kindness is our power, Maya. Never let anyone make you lose that." The hours passed slowly, every moment filled with tension. Sweat beaded along Maya's brow, but she didn't waver. The surgical team worked seamlessly, responding to her commands without hesitation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Maya placed the last suture. She looked up at the monitors. The heartbeat was steady, strong. Whitmore was alive. "Close him up," Maya said softly, stepping back from the table. She stripped off her gloves and mask, exhaustion washing over her like a wave. Later that night, Maya sat alone in the hospital break room, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a quiet stillness that felt heavier than before. She should have felt triumphant. She had saved a life, a difficult, high-stakes surgery, performed flawlessly, but all she felt was empty. She thought back to the look on Whitmore's face when she had first met him. The doubt, the dismissal. It haunted her still. The door opened quietly, and Nurse Reyes stepped in. "Dr. Thompson," she said softly, "the senator's family is here. His son wanted to thank you personally." Maya blinked in surprise. "His son?" "Yes. I told him you were resting, but he insisted on speaking with you when you're ready." Maya exhaled deeply, setting her coffee down. "I'll be out in a minute." As Reyes left, Maya leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the world would keep turning. Whitmore would wake up, and she would go back to her life, the same as before. But tonight, something felt different. For the first time in years, she wondered if healing someone else might help her begin to heal herself. The break room door clicked shut behind Nurse Reyes, leaving Maya alone with the faint hum of the refrigerator and her swirling thoughts. The coffee in her cup had gone cold, but she didn't bother to move. Outside, the world seemed to slow. Her hands rested flat on the small table in front of her, the fingers that had just saved a life now still and contemplative. Senator Charles Whitmore, alive because of her. Maya wondered if he would ever know the weight of the choice she'd made tonight. Probably not. The man had built his career refusing to see people like her, people who didn't fit into his vision of what success looked like, people he dismissed without hesitation. And yet, here he was, breathing because she had chosen to honor her oath. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she called, her voice steady. The door opened slowly, and a tall man stepped inside. He looked to be in his early 30s, with sandy blonde hair and a face that wore its exhaustion like an old coat. David Whitmore, the senator's son. "Dr. Thompson?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Maya nodded. "That's me. Have a seat." David shut the door behind him and took the chair across from her. Up close, Maya could see the dark circles under his eyes and the faint lines of worry etched into his expression. He wasn't as imposing as his father. His posture was uncertain, as though he didn't quite know what to do with himself. "I wanted to thank you," David said softly, "for saving my father. I know it couldn't have been easy for you." The words caught Maya off guard. She had been prepared for formal gratitude, maybe even entitlement, but there was no arrogance in David's voice, only sincerity and something else, something closer to shame. "I was just doing my job," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. David sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You don't have to say that. I know who my father is. I know what he said." He looked up at her, his pale blue eyes searching for something in her expression. "That's why I'm here. I wanted you to know that. Not everyone in my family thinks like him." Maya's stomach tightened. She held his gaze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Did it matter what he thought? Would it change anything? "That's kind of you to say," she finally replied, carefully measured. David leaned back in the chair, his shoulders slumping slightly. "He doesn't listen to me, you know. I've tried for years to get through to him. I argued with him over that scholarship program." He let out a bitter laugh. "He called me naive, said I didn't understand how the real world worked." Maya's chest tightened at the mention of the scholarship. She forced herself to take a deep breath, the weight of that memory threatening to resurface. What happened back then? It wasn't just about me. It was about what he represented. He didn't see me as a person. He saw me as a problem. David's face fell, guilt flickering in his expression. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what it's worth, I tried to fight him, but I didn't fight hard enough." Maya studied him for a moment. She didn't know what she had expected from Whitmore's son, maybe defensiveness, maybe cold indifference. But this was unexpected. His quiet apology sat between them, heavy and unresolved. "People like me don't get to wait for the world to be fair," Maya said finally. "We just keep moving." We build our own paths. David nodded, his jaw tight. I see that now. There was a long silence. Maya didn't know what else to say, and David seemed to understand that. He rose to his feet, his movements slow and uncertain. Thank you again, Dr. Thompson. I won't take up more of your time. Before he reached the door, Maya called after him. David. He turned, his expression expectant. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Your father, he might not change, but that doesn't mean you can't be different. You don't have to carry his legacy. David's expression softened. I'm trying. I just don't know if it's enough. It will be, she replied. If you keep trying, it will be. David gave her a faint, tired smile before slipping out of the room. The door clicked shut, and Maya exhaled, feeling as though something heavy had lifted from her chest. She wasn't sure if David's words meant anything in the long run, but for now, it was enough to know that someone had seen her, really seen her. The following day, Maya sat in her small apartment with a cup of tea, the morning sunlight streaming through her thin curtains. The space was quiet, save for the occasional honk of a car on the street below. Her apartment wasn't much, but it was hers. It was home. She sat on her worn couch, her feet tucked beneath her, and glanced over at the framed photo of her mother. The memory of last night still lingered: the surgery, David's visit, the ghost of Charles Whitmore's words. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind again. Kindness is our power, Maya. Never let anyone make you lose that. For years, Maya had lived by that lesson. She carried her mother's words like a talisman, holding them close even on the hardest days. When she was younger, it had felt like a burden. Why should she have to be the bigger person? Why should she extend grace to those who didn't deserve it? But as she sat there now, staring at her hands, the same hands that had stitched Whitmore's heart back together, she understood. Kindness wasn't weakness. It wasn't surrender. It was strength. It was choosing to rise above, even when every part of you wanted to sink into anger. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking her reverie. It was a text from Dr. Emily Lawson. Emily. You're a rock star, Maya. Heard Whitmore's stable. Drinks on me after our shift tonight? Maya smiled faintly and texted back, You're on. She set the phone down and leaned back into the couch, letting herself breathe. She thought about David Whitmore, his quiet apology, his struggle to break free from his father's shadow. Maybe people could change, or at least try to. Maybe the world wasn't entirely hopeless. Maya glanced at the framed photo again, her mother's smile frozen in time. I saved him, Mama, she whispered. Not for him. For me. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of peace. By the time Maya returned to St. Augustine Medical Center for her evening shift, the world outside had softened into twilight. The hospital parking lot buzzed with the comings and goings of patients, staff, and visitors. Streetlights cast pools of yellow across slick pavement, and Maya felt the chill in the air as she climbed out of her car. Her mind drifted to the previous night's conversation with David Whitmore. His words lingered not in their apology, but in their humanity. For years, the name Whitmore had been an emblem of everything unjust. Now, she wasn't so sure. David's remorse felt real, and his struggle to break free from his father's shadow mirrored something she knew all too well: fighting to be seen for who you are, not who others expect you to be. Maya sighed as she pushed through the hospital doors. The sterile hum of fluorescent lights greeted her, and her professional mask fell into place. It was time to focus. The hospital was quieter in the evening, the hallways lined with muted conversations and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Maya headed to the surgical ward to check on her post-op patients before rounds. As she scanned through charts at the nurse's station, a familiar voice made her pause. Dr. Thompson? She turned to see Nurse Reyes, her expression unreadable, but her tone laced with subtle concern. Whitmore's condition is stable, but he's awake, Reyes said quietly, as though trying not to let the words carry far. Maya's breath caught for half a second before she regained composure. Any complications? None, Reyes replied. But he's asking questions. He wants to know who performed the surgery. Maya held Reyes's gaze, unsure what to make of the statement. Part of her braced for what she already knew, that Charles Whitmore wouldn't take well to the truth. She could imagine the scorn in his voice, the dismissal in his tone, even now. Is his son with him? Maya asked, changing the subject. Reyes nodded. David's been at his bedside since this morning. He hasn't left. Maya exhaled slowly, feeling a tangle of emotions: discomfort, unease, and something close to vindication. Charles Whitmore might never change, but David had at least tried to bridge the distance. Thanks, Reyes, Maya said, tucking the last patient chart under her arm. Let me know if anything changes. Later that evening, as Maya finished her rounds, she found herself lingering near the ward where Whitmore was recovering. She wasn't supposed to check in on him. It wasn't her responsibility anymore. And yet, something compelled her to pause just outside his door. Through the narrow window, she could see him. Charles Whitmore sat propped up in bed, pale but alert. His face, once framed by the polished charisma of public appearances, looked gaunt and fragile under the hospital lights. His eyes flickered toward David, who sat beside him, flipping through a book, but clearly not reading it. Maya felt something twist in her chest, an ache she couldn't quite name. It was surreal seeing him like this, vulnerable, human. Yet, even now, Maya knew his words would be sharp if he ever learned the truth. He would dismiss her. Again, she turned away, walking briskly down the hallway. The shift wound down slowly, the hours stretching late into the night. By the time Maya returned to the break room for a brief pause, her exhaustion had settled into her bones. She dropped onto the worn couch, her head tipping back against the cushion. Long night? Maya opened her eyes to find Dr. Emily Lawson standing in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She wore the same tired expression Maya had seen 100 times before. But there was always a spark of warmth behind it. Always, Maya replied, with a faint smile. Emily handed her a cup and sat down beside her, taking a long sip of her own. The silence between them was companionable, the kind that didn't need to be filled. For a moment, the hospital felt far away. I heard Whitmore's awake, Emily said finally, her voice soft. Maya's smile faded. He doesn't know it was me. Emily studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Do you want him to? Maya considered the question, swirling the coffee in her cup. No, she admitted. Not really. What difference would it make? Emily tilted her head thoughtfully. Maybe none. But maybe it's not about him. Maya looked over at her, eyebrows furrowed. Emily smiled faintly, her voice steady. You saved his life, Maya. Whether he sees it or not, it doesn't change what you did. You chose grace over anger. That's strength, not weakness. Maya's throat tightened at the words, but she said nothing. Emily stood, draining the last of her coffee before heading for the door. Don't let him take this from you, she added over her shoulder. Maya sat alone in the break room, staring down at her hands. The next morning, Maya returned for another shift, the weight of the previous days still lingering. Before starting rounds, she stopped by the nurse's station to grab updated charts. As she did, a voice from down the hallway stopped her cold. Excuse me, where is the attending surgeon? Who saved my father? It was David Whitmore. Maya froze, clutching the clipboard tightly. The nurses exchanged nervous glances before Reyes gestured subtly toward Maya. She's right there, Reyes said softly. Maya turned slowly as David approached, his expression determined. His hair was tousled, and he looked like he hadn't slept, but his gaze was sharp and focused. I was looking for you, David said, stopping just a foot away. I wanted you to come talk to my father. Maya's heart dropped into her stomach. What? He wants to thank the surgeon who saved him, David replied, though his tone was hesitant, as though he wasn't sure his father's intentions were entirely pure. Maya shook her head immediately. That's not necessary. David frowned, frustrated. Dr. Thompson, I know this isn't easy, but he needs to know. You didn't have to save him, but you did. Maybe it'll mean something. Maybe. It won't, Maya cut in, her voice sharp but steady. I did my job, Mr. Whitmore. That's all he needs to know. David looked at her for a long moment, disappointment flickering in his expression. He won't change if no one holds him accountable, he said quietly. Maya sighed, softening. I can't change him. And I don't need him to change to know I did the right thing. David seemed to accept her words, though his frustration remained. For what it's worth, I think what you did was extraordinary, he said finally. Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Maya watched him walk away, her chest tight. By the end of her shift, Maya had all but buried the encounter, throwing herself into her work. She had nearly forgotten about David's plea until Nurse Reyes caught up with her at the nurse's station. Dr. Thompson, Reyes said, handing her a small, neatly folded note. David Whitmore asked me to give this to you. Maya unfolded the note slowly, her brow furrowing as she read the words inside. Sometimes the people who need saving the most don't even realize it. Thank you for reminding me that kindness matters, even when it's hard. David Whitmore. Maya stared at the note for a long moment, her throat tight. She thought about Emily's words the night before, how strength didn't come from anger, but from grace. Maybe David was right. Maybe kindness could ripple outward, even in ways she couldn't yet see. Tucking the note into her pocket, Maya exhaled slowly and headed back down the hall. Her work wasn't done. Not yet. The hum of the city had grown faint by the time Maya returned to her apartment later that night. She pushed open the door, greeted by the familiar quiet and the dim glow of the streetlights seeping through her curtains. The small living room was exactly as she had left it, a neat couch, a coffee table littered with old medical journals, and the framed photograph of her mother perched near the kitchen counter. Maya set her bag down by the door, her movements slow and deliberate. She was tired, but it wasn't the physical exhaustion from the long hours in surgery that weighed on her. It was the kind of fatigue that settled in her chest, making every breath feel heavier than the last. Slipping off her shoes, she walked into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. She leaned against the counter, sipping it absently, as David Whitmore's words played on a loop in her mind. He won't change if no one holds him accountable. Maya set the glass down with a soft clink, shaking her head. I don't need him to change, she muttered to herself. But even as the words left her mouth, she felt the hollowness in them. She glanced at the note David had given her earlier, now crumpled on the counter. His handwriting was neat and precise, the words etched with quiet sincerity. Kindness matters, even when it's hard. For years, Maya had forced herself to believe that Whitmore's opinion of her didn't matter, that she could rise above it, burying her anger in the pursuit of excellence. And yet, every time his name resurfaced, the old wound bled a little. She hated that it still held any power over her. With a sigh, Maya moved to the couch and sank into the worn cushions. The room felt suffocating tonight, its silence amplifying the thoughts she couldn't seem to escape. She reached for the photo of her mother, holding it gently in her hands. I saved him, Mama, she whispered, but it doesn't feel like a victory. The truth was, Whitmore's life wasn't the only thing she had been fighting to save. She had spent years fighting for herself, her place in the world, her right to be seen and valued. And though she had won battles along the way, this one still felt unfinished. The next morning, Maya woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. Blinking against the early sunlight, she grabbed it, her heart sinking slightly when she saw the number. It was Dr. Philip Carter, her former mentor, and one of the few people who had supported her when no one else would. Morning, Dr. Carter, Maya said as she sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Maya," his voice boomed warmly on the other end. "I hope I didn't wake you." "Not at all," she lied, forcing a smile into her voice. "How have you been?" "Busy, as always. But I've been hearing your name floating around again. You've been in the news, you know." Maya tensed. "I figured that might happen." "I wanted to check on you," he continued, his tone softening. "I know the situation isn't easy for you, considering who the patient was." Maya sighed, leaning back against the headboard. "I'm fine, Dr. Carter. It's just complicated." "It always is," he replied. "But you did the right thing, Maya. That's what matters." His words echoed Emily's from the night before, but Maya wasn't sure they were enough to quiet the doubts still rattling in her mind. "Thank you," she said softly. Dr. Carter hesitated on the other end. "You know, Maya, when I first met you, you reminded me of someone who had been forged in fire. I saw a determination in you that was unshakable. But even the strongest people need to heal sometimes. Don't let this weigh you down." His voice was kind but firm, the same tone he had used when Maya was a struggling medical student, fighting to prove herself to the world. Back then, his support had been a lifeline, his belief in her like an anchor in the storm. "Take care of yourself, Maya," he added before hanging up. Maya set the phone down, her heart a little steadier. Later that afternoon, Maya stood in front of her bathroom mirror, brushing the tangles out of her hair. The reflection that stared back at her was composed dark eyes, framed by exhaustion, but still burning with a quiet fire. Her thoughts drifted back to her conversation with Dr. Carter. Even the strongest people need to heal. She hadn't given herself permission to do that in a long time. As Maya finished getting ready for her shift, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from David Whitmore. "David, my father is being discharged tomorrow. I just wanted you to know." Maya stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the screen. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something stopped her. "Maya, thanks for letting me know. How is he?" The reply came quickly. "David, stubborn, but alive. That's thanks to you, whether he'll admit it or not." Maya set the phone down, exhaling deeply. The hospital felt unusually quiet that evening, as though the halls themselves were holding their breath. Maya made her way through her rounds, checking on post-op patients and reviewing charts. When she reached the ward where Whitmore was recovering, she paused. The hallway was empty, save for the faint murmur of a television drifting through an open door. Before she could stop herself, Maya stepped inside. Charles Whitmore lay propped up in the hospital bed, his face pale but alert. His eyes flickered toward her as she entered, narrowing slightly as though he were trying to place her. For a moment, Maya thought he might recognize her. "Dr. Thompson," he said finally, his voice low but sharp. "I hear you're the one who saved me." Maya nodded, keeping her expression unreadable. "I was part of the team, yes." Whitmore studied her for a long moment, his pale blue eyes cold and unreadable. "A shame we had to meet like this." Maya felt her jaw tighten, but she refused to react. "Your condition was critical, Senator. I'm glad you're recovering." He waved a hand dismissively, as though brushing off the thought. "I've been through worse." For a moment, the room fell silent. Maya stared at him, the man who had once reduced her to a single sentence, "Someone like you." She had dreamed of this moment for years, imagining what she might say if given the chance. Would she confront him? Would she tell him what his words had cost her? But standing there now, Maya felt nothing but emptiness. Whitmore's arrogance hadn't wavered, even as he lay in a hospital bed, alive because of her hands. "Rest well, Senator," she said finally, turning toward the door. "Wait." Maya paused, glancing back. Whitmore's expression softened just slightly, as though he were searching for something he couldn't quite name. "You're a good surgeon," he said gruffly. "I suppose that's all that matters in the end." Maya blinked, surprised by the faint flicker of recognition in his voice. It wasn't an apology, not even close, but it was something a crack in the wall he had built so carefully around himself. She gave him a curt nod. "Take care, Senator." As she stepped back into the hallway, Maya felt lighter somehow, as though the weight she had carried for years had shifted ever so slightly. She didn't need his gratitude, his approval, or his recognition. She had saved his life, not for him, but for herself, to prove that kindness was more powerful than hatred. And that was enough. That night, as Maya left the hospital, the air outside felt fresh and cool. The stars peeked through the thin veil of clouds, and for the first time in a long while, Maya let herself breathe deeply. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Dr. Carter. "Dr. Carter, you don't always get to choose your battles, Maya, but you can always choose how you fight them." Maya smiled faintly, tucking her phone back into her pocket. Her journey wasn't over yet, but tonight she felt like she had taken the first step towards something new, something lighter. As she drove home, her hand steady on the wheel, she whispered into the quiet car, "I choose grace." And for the first time, she believed it. The following morning, a clear golden light streamed through the narrow slits of Maya's apartment curtains. The sun had risen with startling brilliance, as if mocking her sleepless night. Maya sat at her small kitchen table, staring down at her untouched cup of coffee. The steam had long since faded, the dark liquid now still and cold. Whitmore's faint words from the night before echoed in her mind. "You're a good surgeon. I suppose that's all that matters in the end." It wasn't gratitude, not by a long shot, but something in his voice, an unwilling flicker of acknowledgement, had unsettled her. She had spent so many years convinced he would never see her as anything but invisible. Perhaps he didn't now, not truly, but the crack in his resolve was enough to send her spiraling into uncomfortable reflection. Why did I go into his room? She wondered. She had told herself she didn't need anything from him, and yet something had pulled her back. Curiosity, maybe, or the simple weight of unfinished history. The buzz of her phone snapped her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a news notification, and her stomach sank. Senator Charles Whitmore discharged after life-saving surgery. Maya swiped open the article. The photo at the top showed Whitmore being wheeled out of the hospital, his son David walking beside him, looking visibly strained. Whitmore sat stiffly in the wheelchair, pale but wearing his trademark stoic expression, waving faintly to the cameras as if he hadn't been closing to death just days earlier. "A fighter to the end," the caption read, quoting Whitmore's brief statement to the press. Maya's throat tightened as she scrolled down. Not a single mention of the surgical team. Not a word about the doctors, nurses, or the hours of effort it had taken to save him. She shouldn't have expected anything more. This was Whitmore, after all. But the lack of acknowledgement of the humanity in the operating room still stung. A soft knock at her front door startled her. Setting the phone down, Maya crossed the small living room and opened it to find Emily Lawson standing there, clutching a to-go coffee cup in each hand and wearing a knowing smile. "I brought reinforcements," Emily said, handing Maya the cup. "I had a feeling you weren't in the mood to make breakfast." Maya smirked faintly, stepping aside to let her in. "I'll never say no to free coffee." Emily plopped onto the couch and kicked off her shoes, looking perfectly at home. Maya followed, collapsing onto the cushion beside her. For a while they just sipped their coffee in silence, Emily waiting patiently for Maya to speak first. Finally, Maya sighed, staring into her cup. "He's out of the hospital. He didn't mention us, any of us." Emily snorted. "I'm not surprised. Men like Whitmore don't make a habit of giving credit to people they think are beneath them." "It's not even about credit," Maya replied quietly, her voice edged with frustration. "It's about acknowledgement. For one moment, I thought maybe he'd change just a little, but nothing's different." Emily's expression softened. Maya, people like him don't change overnight. Sometimes they never change at all. Maya nodded, biting her lip as her thoughts churned. But why does it still bother me so much? I saved his life. I did my job. That should be enough. Emily turned to look at her. It bothers you because you're human, and because you've spent years proving yourself in a world that refuses to see you. Whitmore is just a reminder of that. Maya looked away, staring at the sunlight pooling on the floor. It shouldn't matter, she muttered. But it does, Emily said gently. And that's okay. Just don't let him take away what you've built. Don't let him win. Maya sat with Emily's words for a long moment, her chest tightening. It felt so simple when Emily said it, but in reality, the weight of years spent fighting for recognition of working harder, being better, and holding her anger at bay was exhausting. I just want to move past it, Maya said softly. You will, Emily replied. It's just going to take time. Later that afternoon, Maya returned to the hospital for her next shift, carrying a sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. As she slipped into her office to grab her schedule for the day, a soft knock came at the door. Maya? It was David Whitmore. His presence startled her, though his expression wasn't one of arrogance or pride. Instead, he looked uncomfortable, almost out of place in his pressed suit and tie. What are you doing here? Maya asked, standing straighter. David hesitated, his hands shoved into his pockets. I wanted to talk to you. About what? David shifted on his feet, as though weighing his words carefully. About my father. About everything. Maya crossed her arms, studying him. Go on. David stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him. First, I want to thank you again for saving him. I know you didn't have to. I did have to, Maya replied firmly. It's my job. David nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Maybe, but I also know it took something out of you. I can see it. Maya stared at him, caught off guard by his honesty. David sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. Look, I'm not here to defend him. My father is who he is. He's stubborn. He's blind to a lot of things. I've spent my whole life trying to prove to him that the world isn't as small as he thinks it is. Maya softened slightly. And? David's face darkened. And he never listens. But yesterday, when I told him you were the one who saved him, he paused, his voice dropping. He didn't say much, but he didn't dismiss it either. That's something, even if it's not enough. Maya swallowed the lump rising in her throat, unsure how to respond. I don't know if he'll ever change, David continued. But I don't want to be like him. I don't want to carry that forward. He looked at her earnestly, his voice steady. You saved his life, but you also reminded me of something. That doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Maya looked away, her throat tight. Why are you telling me this? David hesitated before answering. Because I wanted you to know that what you did, what you do, it matters. Even if my father will never say it, I'll say it. You made a difference. The words hit Maya like a wave, soft but overwhelming. She had spent years carrying the weight of people like Charles Whitmore, always pushing forward in silence. And now, here was his son, telling her what she had longed to hear, not for recognition, but for the truth. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, his expression earnest. You're not invisible, Dr. Thompson. I see you, and I hope others will too. He turned to leave, but before he could step out, Maya called after him. David. He paused, glancing back. Don't give up on trying to change things, she said softly. The world needs more people who are willing to try. David smiled faintly. Neither should you. When the door closed behind him, Maya sat down at her desk, her hands trembling slightly. The conversation felt like a release, as though some of the weight she had been carrying for years had finally lifted. She wasn't naive enough to think the world would change overnight. Charles Whitmore would likely remain the man he had always been: dismissive, arrogant, and blind to his own privilege. But David's words had reminded her of something important. The fight wasn't always about winning. Sometimes it was about showing up, doing the right thing, and holding on to your own humanity. Maya looked down at her hands that had saved a life, even one that didn't deserve it. They were steady now, no longer burdened by doubt. Kindness matters, she thought, even when it's hard. And for the first time in a long while, Maya believed it. The steady hum of the hospital air vents filled the silence as Maya settled into the rhythm of her evening rounds. The fluorescent lights washed the hallways in a pale glow, masking the exhaustion on the faces of staff and patients alike. It was a routine Maya welcomed, a predictable flow of checking vitals, answering questions, and offering reassurance where she could. But tonight, even her usual routine couldn't quiet the echoes of her conversation with David Whitmore. "You're not invisible. I see you." His words had clung to her like a stubborn thread, tugging at memories she had spent years suppressing. David's sincerity was unexpected, almost disarming. It was as though someone had peeled back a curtain and revealed a sliver of light she hadn't thought existed. Still, Maya knew better than to let herself hope for more. After finishing her last check-in, Maya headed toward the nurse's station to log her notes. That was when she saw it, a small crowd huddled around the TV mounted on the wall. The volume was low, but she could still hear the anchor's voice carrying through the quiet ward. Senator Charles Whitmore gave his first public appearance today after being discharged from St. Augustine Medical Center earlier this morning. Maya froze mid-step. From where she stood, she could see Whitmore's face on the screen, a clean-cut suit, his pale complexion still faintly lined with recovery. He was seated at a press conference, his expression calm and composed, his hands folded neatly on the table. Beside him stood David, wearing an expression that betrayed the tension just beneath the surface. Nurse Reyes, who had been watching intently, turned and noticed Maya. "Did you hear? He's speaking live." Maya didn't respond. Instead, she stepped closer, her heart sinking as Whitmore began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitmore's familiar voice filled the air, steady and practiced. "As many of you know, I suffered a serious health incident earlier this week. It's been a difficult time, but I am, as always, a fighter. I appreciate the efforts of the medical team at St. Augustine, and I'm grateful to be standing here today." There it was, the vaguest possible nod of acknowledgement. Whitmore didn't mention the surgery, the hours spent in critical care, or the team who had brought him back from the brink. He offered a politician's thanks, empty and impersonal. Maya clenched her jaw, bracing for what might come next. "Some have said this experience should change my outlook," Whitmore continued, a faint smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "But let me be clear. I've always believed in strength, in resilience, and I'm proof of that. I didn't need any special treatment or favors to get through this, just grit and determination. That's what matters." A quiet murmur swept through the staff at the nurse's station. Maya's pulse quickened as the words sank in. She stared at the screen, feeling the blood drain from her face. "I didn't need any special treatment." The statement was a gut punch, each syllable laced with the same dismissiveness that had haunted her all these years. It was a refusal not just of gratitude, but of reality itself. He had erased her, the hours she spent in surgery, and the very hands that had saved his life. Maya turned abruptly, walking away from the nurses and down the hallway. She needed air, space, anything to clear the pressure building in her chest. The rooftop of St. Augustine Medical Center was quiet, a small hidden space where staff sometimes went to escape the chaos below. The cold night air bit at Maya's skin as she leaned against the railing, staring out at the city skyline. Lights from office buildings blinked in the distance, and the faint hum of traffic rose up from the streets below. She breathed in deeply, trying to steady herself. Why am I surprised? She thought bitterly. She had always known Whitmore would never change, but hearing it, seeing it still cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Behind her, the sound of the door creaking open made her shoulders stiffen. Footsteps echoed softly against the concrete. Maya? It was Emily. Maya didn't turn around. She heard Emily approach and lean against the railing beside her, but neither of them spoke for a long moment. "You saw the press conference, didn't you?" Emily finally asked, her voice soft. Maya let out a bitter laugh, though it lacked any real humor. "I saw it, and I heard it." Emily didn't reply right away. She simply waited, as though giving Maya permission to say everything she had been holding back. "He erased me," Maya said finally, her voice low. "All of us. The team. The surgery. It's like none of it happened." Emily frowned, her expression darkening. "That's who he is. You knew that." "I did," Maya admitted, "but it still feels like a slap in the face. Like nothing I did mattered." "Of course it mattered," Emily replied firmly, turning to face her. "It mattered to David. It mattered to the staff who saw you. It mattered to the people you inspire every single day, Maya." Maya shook her head, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I didn't save him for his gratitude, Em. I didn't expect him to thank me. But I don't know. I thought maybe there'd be something more." A sliver of acknowledgement, of decency. Emily studied her carefully before speaking again. "You didn't save him for him, Maya. You saved him because that's who you are. That's what makes you different. People like him, they'll never see it, and they'll never change. But that doesn't make what you did any less extraordinary." Maya swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to believe Emily's words, but the bitterness still lingered like ash on her tongue. "It's exhausting, you know," Maya said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fighting so hard, doing everything right, and still being invisible." Emily reached out, resting a hand gently on Maya's arm. "I see you. David sees you. And you know what? The world is changing, even if people like Whitmore refuse to see it." Maya turned to look at her, the tightness in her chest easing just slightly. Emily's expression was steady, her belief in Maya unshakable. "You can't carry his ignorance," Emily continued. "You can only carry yourself, and what you did, what you always do, is more than enough." Maya exhaled slowly, the weight beginning to lift. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe her worth wasn't tied to what Whitmore thought, said, or did. Maybe her strength wasn't in the recognition she received, but in the choices. She made choices that defined who she was, not who the world told her to be. By the time Maya made her way back inside, the halls had quieted, and the city beyond the hospital windows had grown darker. She returned to her office, sat down at her desk, and pulled out the crumpled note David had given her days before. "Kindness matters, even when it's hard." She smoothed the paper out carefully, staring at the words. In saving Whitmore, Maya hadn't just honored her oath as a doctor. She had proven something to herself, that her kindness, her integrity, and her humanity were stronger than the hatred and ignorance that had once sought to hold her back. As she tucked the note back into her pocket, Maya felt the faintest flicker of hope. Whitmore hadn't changed, and maybe he never would, but David had. People like Emily had. And Maya realized that she wasn't fighting for the Charles Whitmores of the world. She was fighting for the future, the one she had built with her own two hands, and the one still waiting to be shaped by the hands of others. With that thought, she leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and allowed herself to breathe. Maya sat in the hospital break room, the hum of the vending machine filling the silence. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second stretching longer than the last. She had pulled herself together after the rooftop conversation with Emily, but the weight of Whitmore's press conference still lingered in her chest like a dull ache. She looked down at her hands, hands that had cut, stitched, and saved. Her mother's words echoed faintly in her mind. Kindness is our power, Maya. Never let anyone make you lose that. The break room door opened, and Dr. Philip Carter stepped inside. He was older now, his dark hair speckled with gray, but his presence still carried the same quiet authority. Maya, he greeted warmly, his smile small but reassuring. She glanced up and managed a faint smile. "Dr. Carter, what brings you here?" He pulled out the chair across from her, the legs scraping gently against the tile floor. "I had a meeting with the hospital board. Thought I'd check on you while I was here." He paused, his eyes scanning her face. "Word about Whitmore's press conference has made its way around, hasn't it?" Maya snorted softly, shaking her head. "Of course it has. You can't avoid him, not even here." Dr. Carter tilted his head thoughtfully, his expression kind but firm. "How are you holding up?" Maya hesitated, then sighed, the words coming out before she could stop them. "I don't know. I thought I was prepared for it, that nothing he said or did would affect me. But when he sat there, acting like he saved himself, it felt like a slap in the face, like what I did didn't matter at all." Dr. Carter studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You know, Maya, people like Whitmore have spent their whole lives believing the world revolves around them. They can't imagine anyone else being strong enough to save them, because that would mean admitting their own vulnerability." Maya looked away, her fingers curling around the edge of her coffee cup. "I know that, but it doesn't make it easier." "No, it doesn't," he agreed softly. "But let me ask you something. Did you save him for his gratitude?" She shook her head immediately. "No, I saved him because it's my job, because it's who I am." Dr. Carter smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "Exactly. And no matter what he says or doesn't say, you did something extraordinary. You held true to yourself when it would have been easier to walk away. That's not just strength, Maya. That's character." Maya's throat tightened as his words sank in. It was something she'd heard before from her mother, from Emily, but hearing it now, from someone who had seen her struggles firsthand, made it hit differently. "You remind me of myself," Dr. Carter continued. "When I was a young black doctor, the world didn't believe someone like me belonged here. I heard it from patients, colleagues, even people who were supposed to be on my side. But I made a choice. I wasn't going to let their ignorance define my future." Maya met his gaze, her heart catching in her chest. Dr. Carter leaned forward slightly, his voice soft, but steady. "Don't let Whitmore take this from you, Maya. You don't need his recognition to know your worth. You've already proven it to yourself and to everyone who matters." Maya swallowed hard, feeling the truth in his words. For so long, she had carried the burden of proving herself, fighting for recognition, in a world that so often refused to see her. But maybe the fight wasn't about them. Maybe it had never been about them. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter nodded, rising from his chair. "Keep walking your path, Maya. The world needs people like you, even if it doesn't know it yet." With that, he gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze and left the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway. That night, as Maya walked through the dimly lit hospital parking lot, she felt the cool air against her skin. The city was quiet, its skyline illuminated by the faint glow of streetlights and distant windows. The world felt bigger tonight, and for once, that didn't scare her. When she reached her car, she paused, leaning against the door and staring up at the sky. The stars were faint, barely visible above the haze, but they were there, steady and constant, even when they couldn't be seen. "Don't let Whitmore take this from you." Dr. Carter's words played in her mind, mingling with memories of her mother's voice, Emily's encouragement, and David's quiet sincerity. Maybe Whitmore would never change. Maybe the world would always feel stacked against her in ways she couldn't control. But that didn't mean she had lost. Maya's journey had never been about him. It had been about her. She thought back to the little girl she used to be, the girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor, who stayed up late studying by the light of a flickering lamp because her mother couldn't afford to pay the electric bill some months. That girl had believed in something bigger, something worth fighting for, and Maya realized that she still did. The next morning, Maya awoke to the sound of her phone buzzing against her nightstand. Squinting at the screen, she saw a message from Nurse Reyes. Reyes, check the front desk when you get in. Someone left something for you. Curious, Maya made her way to the hospital earlier than usual. The front desk attendant, a cheerful woman named Angie, handed her a small envelope as soon as she walked in. It came this morning, Angie said with a smile. Someone dropped it off and didn't leave a name. Maya frowned slightly, taking the envelope and stepping into a quiet corner of the lobby. She tore it open carefully, revealing a small folded note and a single photograph. The note was written in David Whitmore's neat handwriting. You said not to give up on trying to change things. I won't. I thought you might like to see this. Maya unfolded the photograph and stared at it, her breath catching. It was an old photo, faded and slightly bent at the edges of her standing at a scholarship award ceremony when she was a teenager. Her mother was beside her, beaming with pride. Maya's younger self wore a bright smile, holding her certificate high, full of hope and determination. Her chest tightened as she realized what the photo meant. Somehow, David had tracked down a piece of her past proof of who she had always been, even before the world was ready to see her. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as she held the photograph close. For so long, Whitmore's words had haunted her, making her question whether she belonged, whether she was enough. But this photo, this small piece of her history, reminded her of the truth. She had always been enough, and no one, not Whitmore, not the world, could take that away from her. That evening, as Maya stepped into the operating room for another long surgery, she felt lighter than she had in years. The room buzzed with quiet preparation, nurses checking instruments, monitors beeping softly in the background. Maya donned her gloves and mask, staring down at the patient lying unconscious before her. Another life, another chance to do what she had always been meant to do. As the team moved into place, Nurse Reyes smiled at her from across the table. Ready, Dr. Thompson? Maya nodded, her voice steady. Let's get to work. Her hands that had been doubted, dismissed, and underestimated moved with precision and purpose. In this space, she was exactly who she was meant to be, a healer, a fighter, a survivor. And as she made her first incision, Maya knew one thing for certain. She had won. The sound of steady beeping filled the quiet of the operating room. Maya's gloved hands moved with calm precision, carefully stitching the final suture into place. The long surgery had been a success. She didn't need anyone to say it. She could feel it in the rhythm of her breathing, in the quiet focus of her team as they prepared to close. Vitals are strong, doctor, Nurse Reyes said softly, her voice breaking the silence. Maya exhaled slowly, glancing up at the monitor. The numbers blinked steady and reassuring, a reflection of hours of flawless teamwork. She felt the familiar sense of satisfaction settling in her chest. Saving lives was what she did best, and in this space surrounded by the hum of machines and the quiet purpose of the team, nothing else mattered. Let's close him up, Maya instructed, stepping back as the team moved to finish. As she peeled off her gloves and mask, the weight she carried outside these walls began to creep back in. The success of the surgery hadn't erased the noise in her mind, the lingering sting of Whitmore's press conference, the unexpected gift from David, and the old wounds still healing beneath the surface. Maya slipped out of the operating room and headed for the scrub room, her heart pounding in that quiet, unshakable way that signaled her body was still catching up to the moment. She stood at the sink, scrubbing the remnants of the surgery off her hands, her movements methodical but detached. When she looked up into the mirror, her reflection stared back. Her face was composed as always, dark eyes steady, jaw firm, but the weariness was there too, lingering in the faint lines along her forehead, the shadows beneath her eyes. She held her hands under the stream of water, watching it swirl down the drain as she thought back to the photograph David had given her. It was the smile in that photo that haunted her, the brightness in her younger self's eyes, so full of belief that hard work would make the world fair. That girl hadn't known what it would feel like to be dismissed, doubted, or erased, but she had carried that light anyway. Where did that version of me go? Maya wondered. She turned off the water, the sound of rushing liquid replaced by the faint hum of fluorescent lights. She dried her hands slowly, her movements steady, before exiting the scrub room and heading for the break room. She needed a moment, a pause in the relentless hum of the hospital. The break room was empty when Maya stepped inside. The faint aroma of coffee hung in the air, though the pot on the counter had likely been sitting for hours. She poured herself a cup anyway, taking a tentative sip as she dropped into the worn couch. The bitter liquid grounded her, but her mind refused to settle. The truth was, the photograph David had given her had stirred something deeper than she'd realized. It wasn't just a reminder of who she had been, it was a mirror to everything she still carried. The anger, the exhaustion, the endless fight to prove herself, and the quiet hope she had never quite let go of. The sound of the door opening startled her, and Maya glanced up to see David Whitmore stepping inside. He paused in the doorway, his expression unsure, as though he wasn't certain whether he should stay. "I'm not interrupting, am I?" he asked carefully. Maya shook her head, gesturing toward the empty seat across from her. "No, it's fine." David sat down, his posture less composed than usual. He looked tired, the lines on his face more pronounced. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing at the floor before speaking. "I wanted to see how you were doing," he said finally. Maya raised an eyebrow. "I'm fine, David. You don't have to keep checking on me." David hesitated, then looked up at her, his expression earnest. "I know, but I feel like I need to." Maya frowned slightly, studying him. "Why?" David leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Because I've spent years trying to undo the damage my father has caused, trying to be better, but it doesn't feel like enough. And after everything you've done, everything you've had to carry because of him, I can't pretend it doesn't matter, because it does." Maya stared at him, surprised by the rawness in his voice. David exhaled slowly, as though gathering his thoughts. "I saw the way he looked at you in the hospital, the way he spoke at that press conference. He doesn't see it, does he? What you've done, who you are." Maya's jaw tightened, her voice steady, but edged with frustration. "No, he doesn't, and he probably never will." David looked down at his hands, his face clouded with guilt. "I hate that. I hate that someone like you could do something so incredible, and he refuses to see it." Maya let the silence hang between them for a moment, feeling the depth of his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer this time. "You can't control what your father sees, David, or what he believes. I've spent years learning that lesson." David looked up at her. "So how do you keep going? How do you keep doing what you do when the world feels so blind?" Maya paused, staring into her coffee cup as though it held the answer. "Because I don't do it for them," she said quietly. "I do it for the people who need me, for the patients on the table, for the team I work with, for the people who fought to get me here. My mother, my mentors, they believed in me when no one else did. That's why I keep going." David listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "And what about you? Do you believe in yourself?" The question caught her off guard, and Maya looked up at him, startled. David gave her a faint smile. I'm serious. You fight for everyone else, but do you fight for yourself? Maya felt her throat tighten at the question. She thought of the photograph he'd given her, of the younger version of herself who believed she could change the world. That girl had fought for herself fiercely, unrelentingly. Somewhere along the way, though, Maya had started fighting to survive instead. I'm trying, she admitted softly. David nodded, leaning back in his chair. Well, you should. You've done more than enough to deserve it. Maya blinked, his words settling somewhere deep in her chest. It was strange, hearing validation from someone who had grown up in the shadow of a man who had tried to silence her. And yet, David's sincerity was undeniable. Thanks, she said quietly. David stood, slipping his hands into his pockets. I'm leaving tomorrow. Heading back to D.C., I didn't want to go without saying that. You've reminded me that people can do better, even when it's hard. I'm going to try to live up to that. Maya offered him a small smile. Good. The world could use more people like that. David gave her a final nod before heading toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle, glancing back. And Maya? Don't stop fighting for yourself. You're worth it. When the door clicked shut behind him, the room fell silent again. Maya sat alone, staring at the empty seat where David had been. His words lingered. Do you fight for yourself? She had fought for so many things, for her education, her career, her patience. But had she fought for herself, for the light in her that still burned despite everything? She reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph David had given her. The younger Maya in the picture smiled back at her, full of hope and fire. I'm still here, she whispered to herself. And in that moment, Maya knew she would keep fighting, not for Charles Whitmore, not for recognition, but for herself and the people who believed in her, for the light that had never gone out. The hospital felt quieter than usual the next morning, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Maya stood at her desk, flipping through patient charts, trying to push the lingering conversation with David from her mind. But his words had planted themselves there, growing roots she couldn't ignore. Do you fight for yourself? It was a question she didn't have an easy answer for, though it lingered like an unfinished thought. She had spent so much time fighting for others, for her family, her patients, her future, that she'd forgotten what it meant to fight for her own peace. Her phone buzzed against the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Dr. Philip Carter, her old mentor. Dr. Carter, can you come by my office when you have a moment? There's something you should see. Maya frowned slightly, curiosity tugging at her. Dr. Carter wasn't the kind of man to call for something insignificant. She grabbed her coat, letting Nurse Reyes know she'd be stepping out for a bit, and made her way toward the far wing of the hospital, where the senior doctors had their offices. The walk felt longer than usual, the rhythmic sound of her footsteps punctuating her thoughts. By the time she reached Dr. Carter's door, her heart was pounding softly, though she couldn't quite explain why. Come in, his voice called after her gentle knock. Maya stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Dr. Carter sat behind his large mahogany desk, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he flipped through a thick manila folder. He looked up when she entered, his face breaking into a small, familiar smile. Thank you for coming, Maya, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Sit down. What's going on? She asked, her tone cautious as she took a seat. Dr. Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed the folder toward her. It was marked with a name in bold black lettering that made Maya's breath catch. Whitmore, Charles. Her gaze darted to Dr. Carter, her brow furrowed. What is this? Go on, he said gently. Look inside. Maya hesitated for a moment before pulling the folder closer and flipping it open. Inside were records, medical charts, procedure notes, and letters. Old letters, typed on yellowed paper, addressed to a scholarship board. Her stomach dropped as she skimmed the first page. To whom it may concern, I regret to inform you that the applicant in question, Maya Thompson, does not meet the values and standards of this program. The words blurred for a moment as anger and disbelief surged through her. She didn't need to see the signature at the bottom to know who had written it: Charles Whitmore. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned to the next page, scanning the lines of formal rejection that had followed Whitmore's words. These were the letters, the ones that had shattered her future all those years ago, the ones that had forced her to scrape and claw her way to medical school on her own. "I don't understand," Maya whispered, her voice tight. "Why are you showing me this?" Dr. Carter leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "Because you deserve to know the truth." Maya looked up at him, confusion clouding her expression. Dr. Carter exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "Maya, when you lost that scholarship, I knew something wasn't right. I made some calls back then, pulled some strings to try and figure out what happened. It wasn't until much later that I found these letters. Whitmore didn't just deny you a scholarship, he sabotaged you. He used his influence to make sure you didn't receive it." Maya's pulse quickened, her mind reeling. She stared down at the letters, the weight of the past pressing into her chest like a stone. He did this on purpose," she said faintly, the words barely audible. "Yes," Dr. Carter replied softly. "He did. And I'm sorry you had to carry that burden without knowing why." Maya swallowed hard, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. All these years, she had believed that Whitmore's words had been dismissive, careless, just another mark of his prejudice. But this was deliberate. He hadn't just doubted her. He had tried to ruin her. And yet, despite his efforts, here she was. A surgeon, a healer, someone who had saved his life with the same hands he had once tried to hold back. "Why now?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Why show me this now?" Dr. Carter's expression softened. "Because you need to see how far you've come, Maya. This man tried to silence you, but he failed. You rose anyway, and no one can take that from you." Maya's eyes burned, but she blinked back the tears, refusing to let them fall. She looked down at the letters again, the bitterness of the past rising in her throat like bile. "I don't know what to do with this," she admitted quietly. Dr. Carter smiled faintly. "You don't have to do anything. That's the beauty of it. You've already won. These letters don't define you anymore. They're just proof of what you overcame." Maya stared at him for a long moment, her heart thudding in her chest. Dr. Carter was right. These words, the ones Whitmore had wielded like weapons, held no power over her now. She had built her life without his approval, without his help, and in spite of his sabotage, she had already won. That evening, Maya returned to her apartment, the letters tucked safely in her bag. She wasn't sure why she had taken them with her, but part of her couldn't let them go just yet. She sat on the floor of her living room, her back against the couch, the papers spread out in front of her like fragments of a life she no longer recognized. In the center of it all lay the photograph David had given her. Her younger self smiled back at her, full of hope and fire. Maya picked up the photo, running her thumb along its edges. That girl had been hurt, betrayed, but she had also been strong. She had refused to give up, even when the world had told her she wasn't enough. "You were always enough," Maya whispered softly, as though speaking to the girl in the photo. "We made it." Her phone buzzed beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from David Whitmore. "David, I hope you're doing okay. I meant what I said. Don't stop fighting for yourself. You deserve peace too." Maya smiled faintly, typing back a response. "Maya, I'm working on it. Thank you." As she set the phone down, a quiet calm settled over her. The anger, the resentment, the weight of the past, it was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. Whitmore's sabotage had shaped her life, yes, but it hadn't defined it. She had built her future with her own two hands, and no one, not even him, could take that away. For the first time in years, Maya allowed herself to feel proud, not just of what she had achieved, but of how far she had come. She folded the letters carefully, tucking them into the back of her desk drawer. They were a reminder now not of what she had lost, but of what she had overcome. Her fight wasn't over. It never would be. But for tonight, Maya let herself breathe, let herself rest. She looked out the window at the city lights blinking against the dark, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could see the horizon. "I'm still here," she whispered to herself again, a quiet promise. And she knew she always would be. The morning light filtered softly through Maya's apartment window, painting her small living room in hues of pale gold. The letters from Dr. Carter were now tucked safely away in her desk drawer, but their weight lingered quietly in her mind, like a stone at the bottom of a lake. Maya stood at her kitchen counter, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The heat seeped into her palms, grounding her. For the first time in years, she felt as though the past had been unmasked. Charles Whitmore's deliberate sabotage had shaped her journey, but it hadn't broken her. She took a slow sip, her eyes drifting to the framed photograph of her mother on the counter. Maya's voice came soft, barely audible. "We made it, Mama." And in the stillness of the room, those words felt final. Not an ending, but a closing of the wound she had carried for so long. When Maya arrived at St. Augustine Medical Center, the halls were already alive with the quiet hustle of the day. Nurses wheeled carts, patients were escorted to and from appointments, and the faint hum of conversation echoed in the sterile air. Maya's shoes clicked softly against the polished floors as she made her way to the surgical ward. Her schedule was packed, a long day of back-to-back procedures. It was exactly how she liked it. In the operating room, there were no debates, no headlines, no sabotage. There was only the work, and the work was pure. As Maya washed her hands before her first surgery, Nurse Reyes stepped into the scrub room, her face lined with a faint smile. "Dr. Thompson?" Maya glanced up, her brow furrowing. "What's up, Reyes? There's a family here that's asked for you specifically. I told them you're booked all day, but they insisted they'd wait." Maya blinked. "A family? Do I know them?" Reyes shook her head. "Doesn't seem like it. They said you performed surgery on their son months ago. They didn't explain much, but they brought cookies." She smirked faintly. "Homemade, too." Maya chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Cookies, huh? Well, you can let them know I'll come by when I'm done here." "Will do," Reyes replied, disappearing through the doorway. Maya returned her focus to scrubbing in. She didn't recognize the description, but this kind of thing happened occasionally. Some patients or families, grateful for a second chance at life, brought small gifts, notes, fruit baskets, even knitted scarves. Maya never expected anything, but when it happened, it reminded her why the fight mattered. She finished scrubbing in and stepped into the operating room. Hours later, Maya peeled off her gloves after her final surgery of the day. Her body ached in that familiar, satisfying way that came from giving everything she had to her work. The surgery had been a success, and the patient's vitals were stable. Another life saved. Still in her scrubs, Maya made her way to the hospital lobby, where Reyes had mentioned the waiting family. She spotted them immediately, a mother and father sitting together on the edge of a couch, clutching a small tin of cookies in their laps. The woman looked up first, her face lighting up as she saw Maya approach. "Dr. Thompson?" the woman said, standing quickly and smoothing her skirt nervously. "I'm so sorry to bother you. I know how busy you must be." Maya offered a kind smile. "It's no bother at all. How can I help you?" The woman exchanged a glance with her husband, who stood as well, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. There was a pause, one that stretched just long enough for Maya to sense the emotion simmering beneath it. "You operated on our son, Ethan." the woman said softly. 4 months ago. He was in a car accident. They told us, they told us he wouldn't make it. Maya frowned slightly, searching her memory. Then it clicked: a young boy, maybe 10 years old, brought into the ER with internal bleeding. His condition had been critical, the kind of case where seconds made all the difference. Maya remembered the hours spent in the operating room, the careful precision it had taken to save him. "How is he?" she asked gently. The woman's eyes shimmered with tears, and she smiled. "He's perfect. He's back in school. He's playing soccer again. He wanted to come with us today, but he had a game. He told us to bring you these." The woman extended the tin of cookies toward Maya, her hands trembling slightly. Maya accepted it carefully, feeling the warmth of the gesture. "I'm so glad he's doing well," Maya said, her voice soft. "Thank you for coming all this way." The man, Ethan's father, cleared his throat, his voice gruff with emotion. "We didn't just come to say thank you. We came to tell you. What you did for him saved all of us. He's our only child, and when we thought we'd lost him—" He trailed off, looking away as his voice broke. "You gave us a miracle." Maya's throat tightened as their words sank in. The mother stepped closer, her expression earnest. "Dr. Thompson, we know there are people in this world who don't see the work you do, who don't see you. But we do. We see you. And we're so grateful." Maya swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. She had spent so much time pushing back against people like Whitmore, fighting to be seen and valued. But standing here, in this quiet moment, none of that mattered. This was why she did what she did. This family, their son, their gratitude, it was everything. "Thank you," Maya whispered, her voice thick. The mother smiled tearfully, squeezing Maya's hand before stepping back. "You're a gift, Dr. Thompson. Never forget that." Maya watched as the couple turned and left the hospital, their shoulders lighter, their steps purposeful. She held the tin of cookies close to her chest, her heart full in a way she hadn't felt in years. That evening, Maya sat at her kitchen table with the small tin of cookies in front of her. She opened it slowly, smiling as she saw the misshapen chocolate chips nestled inside. Tucked beneath the lid was a note, written in a child's handwriting. "Thank you, Dr. Thompson, for fixing me so I can play soccer again. You're the best doctor ever. Love, Ethan." Maya pressed the note to her chest, her eyes stinging as tears threatened to fall. She thought of Whitmore, of the anger and resentment she had carried for so long. His words had once made her feel invisible, but this family had reminded her of the truth. Maya's work mattered. She mattered. Not because someone like Whitmore chose to see her, but because she had chosen to show up every single day and give her best. Her mother's voice echoed softly in her mind. "Kindness is our power, Maya." Maya smiled through her tears, setting the note carefully beside her mother's framed photograph. "I see you, Mama," she whispered, "and I see me, too." For the first time in a long while, Maya allowed herself to feel whole. She didn't need Whitmore's approval, and she didn't need the world to change overnight. She had already won by choosing to be the person she had always believed she could be. She picked up one of the cookies, taking a small bite as she glanced at the photograph. The taste was imperfect, but sweet, a reminder that life, in all its messiness, was still good. Outside, the city lights glimmered against the night sky, steady and unwavering, just like her, and for the first time, Maya felt at peace. A week later, Maya stood in the bright morning sun, outside St. Augustine Medical Center. She'd just finished her rounds, but for once, she wasn't rushing to her next task. She paused at the entrance, her gaze drifting to the city beyond, where life moved on in its endless rhythm. In her pocket, she still carried Ethan's handwritten note. It was wrinkled now, worn from being unfolded, and read more times than she could count. The words reminded her of something important, something she would carry with her always. "You're the best doctor ever." The world didn't need to see her all at once. The press, the politicians, and the headlines could continue to ignore her. None of that mattered. What mattered were the lives she touched, the children, like Ethan, the families who went home whole, and the quiet victories that no one would ever write about. Maya turned back toward the hospital, her steps steady, her heart light. For every challenge she had faced, for every moment of doubt, there was still hope. And hope, Maya realized, was enough to keep her going. To everyone who has joined Maya's journey, thank you for being here. This story is about more than one surgeon or one act of kindness. It's about resilience, perseverance, and choosing grace, even when the world makes it hard. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you something to think about, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows stories like this to continue reaching people who need them. Let's keep spreading stories of hope, kindness, and strength, one chapter at a time. Thank you, and see you in the next story.